In the dark silence above the clouds, a lone aircraft glided across enemy skies. Its pilot, trained for secrecy, believed he was untouchable, flying higher than any Soviet missile could reach. The mission was simple: capture images of hidden missile sites deep inside the Soviet Union. But within minutes, everything began to unravel. Radar screens in Moscow lit up, alarms blared, and Soviet commanders realized an American spy plane was in their airspace. What was meant to be a quiet operation suddenly turned into a crisis that could ignite a global war. The CIA had pushed its luck too far, and the world was about to pay the price for one mistake. The early 1960s were years of deep unease, a time when the entire world seemed trapped between two powers that could destroy it with the push of a button. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in an ideological and military struggle that stretched from the skies above to the oceans below. Each nation believed it was defending the future of civilization itself. America stood for democracy and capitalism, while the Soviet Union championed communism and state control. Their rivalry touched every part of the globe, turning small nations into battlegrounds for influence and control. The threat of nuclear war loomed constantly. Both sides possessed enough atomic weapons to erase humanity many times over. Cities held evacuation drills, families built bomb shelters, and people lived with the haunting knowledge that life could end in a flash of light. At the same time, both nations were racing to develop even more advanced weapons, missiles that could travel across continents and deliver destruction within minutes. Every new launch or weapons test by one side sent waves of panic through the other. In this climate of suspicion, intelligence became the most valuable weapon. Neither side could afford to be blind to what the other was doing. The fear of falling behind pushed both to expand their spy networks across Europe, Asia, and beyond. Every piece of information, every secret photograph, could shift the balance of power. The CIA, driven by this sense of urgency, became obsessed with uncovering the Soviet Union's hidden military projects. There were rumors of new missile sites deep inside Soviet territory, bases that could strike American cities before anyone could respond. But satellite technology was still in its infancy, and the only way to confirm the truth was to send men into the sky to see it with their own eyes. This was the dangerous world in which the CIA operated, one where a single mission, a single photograph, could decide the fate of nations. To protect America and maintain its edge, the agency planned a daring operation that would pierce the very heart of Soviet airspace. It was a mission born from fear, ambition, and the desperate need to know the enemy's next move. Operation Grand Slam was the codename for what was meant to be one of the CIA's most important missions during the Cold War. It was a bold effort to pierce the Iron Curtain, uncover the Soviet Union's most guarded secrets. At the heart of this mission was a technological marvel, the U-2 spy plane, slim, long-winged, and almost bird-like in appearance. It could soar at an altitude of over 70,000 feet, far higher than any known Soviet aircraft or missile could reach. From that height, its cameras could capture astonishingly clear images of missile sites, airbases, and military installations scattered deep within Soviet territory. Each photograph taken on these flights could change the balance of power, revealing how far the Soviets had advanced in their nuclear program. The pilot chosen for this extraordinary mission was Francis Gary Powers, a calm, precise, and highly trained aviator who had once flown fighter jets for the U.S. Air Force before being recruited into the CIA's top-secret reconnaissance division. He was among the elite few trusted to operate the U-2, a plane that demanded absolute focus and skill. Powers was trained not only in flying but in silence. He learned how to vanish from the world, to fly missions that never officially existed, and to carry secrets he could never speak about. His training included long endurance flights, handling the fragile aircraft in thin air, and knowing how to destroy sensitive equipment if captured. He understood that if anything went wrong, the United States would deny his existence. To the CIA, the mission seemed almost routine. The U-2 had flown over the Soviet Union multiple times before without incident. Soviet radar could detect the aircraft, but their missiles simply couldn't reach that altitude. American engineers and intelligence officers were convinced the U-2's combination of height and speed. Each previous flight had returned with thousands of images, revealing factories, missile ranges, and airfields that had been invisible to the outside world. Operation Grand Slam was designed to be the last and most complete mission before an important peace summit between President Eisenhower and Premier Khrushchev. The CIA hoped that the data gathered would give the U.S. an upper hand in the negotiations, showing exactly what the Soviets were capable of. Inside CIA headquarters, the atmosphere was one of cautious confidence. Technicians checked the aircraft's cameras and oxygen systems one last time. Analysts planned the route carefully, charting a path that would take the U-2 across key Soviet regions from the Baikonur Cosmodrome to missile bases in the Ural Mountains. Powers was briefed on every detail, told to stay calm, and reminded that this flight was of the highest national importance. At the time, no one doubted the plane's safety. It had never failed before. The U-2 was considered America's untouchable eye in the sky. Yet, unknown to the CIA and to Powers himself, the Soviet Union had quietly developed new weapon surface-to-air missiles, powerful enough to reach the heights once thought unreachable. The stage was set for a disaster that would shake the world and bring the superpowers to the brink of war. As Francis Gary Powers guided the U-2 through the cold upper atmosphere, the world beneath him looked peaceful enough. Patchwork of rivers, forests, and cities blurred by distance. At 70,000 feet, he was beyond the reach of almost everything human. The engines hummed steadily. The sky above faded from blue to black, and he felt as if he were alone in space. Yet far below, the stillness he saw from his cockpit was a deception. Inside Soviet command centers, deep in reinforced bunkers, radar screens began to flicker with strange signals. A small, fast-moving object had appeared on their scopes. Traveling across the heart of the Soviet Union, at first, technicians thought it might be an error, a brief ghost on the screen. But the signal persisted, steady and unmistakable. Within minutes, alerts were sent up the chain of command. The Soviet military knew that no aircraft of their own could reach such an altitude. The conclusion was chilling. It had to be an American spy plane. The news spread quickly to Moscow, where air defense commanders ordered immediate action. The Cold War had trained everyone to expect the worst. Every unexplained contact could be the start of a nuclear attack. Across several airfields, fighter pilots rushed to their planes. The roar of engines echoed as MiG interceptors climbed toward the intruder. But the thin air, at extreme altitude, defeated them. The jets stalled, their engines starving for oxygen. The U-2 remained far above an unreachable silver speck against the dark sky. Desperation grew in the Soviet ranks. If the aircraft could not be intercepted, it would continue photographing secret bases, missile sites, and nuclear launch pads. The generals gave the order to use their newest weapon, the S-75 Dvina surface-to-air missile, known to NATO as the SA-2 missile cruise. In the city of Sverdlovsk, received the command to prepare for launch. In a blur of motion, covers slid open, fuel pumps whirred, and the missiles were raised skyward. When the firing code was transmitted, the ground shook. A series of deafening blasts tore through the air as several missiles streaked toward the heavens, leaving white trails behind them. Powers noticed faint flashes below and thought they might be artillery fire or lightning. Then a sudden burst of light exploded near his left wing. The shockwaves slammed through the fuselage, tearing the aircraft apart. In an instant, the U-2 that had seemed invincible was shattered. Inside the cockpit, alarms screamed. The plane rolled violently, pieces breaking away. Powers struggled to regain control, but the U-2 was falling fast. He reached for the ejection handle, fighting against the pressure that pinned him to his seat. At the last possible moment, he was thrown clear, tumbling through the thin air before his parachute snapped open. Below him, he could see the wreckage burning in a field. Soviet villagers watched the strange object descend from the sky, unsure if it was a pilot or a weapon. When he hit the ground, soldiers were already approaching. Weapons drawn, they surrounded him, shouting orders he couldn't understand. Within minutes, he was taken into custody and driven away to be interrogated. For the Soviet commanders, the capture was both a triumph and a nightmare. They had successfully downed a foreign aircraft that had dared to cross their borders. But the presence of an American pilot inside their territory raised terrifying questions. Was this the first stage of an attack? Were more planes coming, armed with nuclear bombs? Across the Soviet Union, defense systems switched to full readiness. Radar operators scanned the skies for additional contacts. Missile units reloaded, and bomber crews sat waiting for orders that, if given, would begin a global war. Back in Washington, silence filled the CIA's communication rooms. The mission's signal had vanished without warning. Analysts tried to convince themselves that powers had turned back, or that there was a technical malfunction. But deep down, everyone knew something had gone terribly wrong. In a matter of hours, what had begun as a quiet intelligence operation would unravel into an international disaster, one that pushed the United States and the Soviet Union closer to nuclear war than anyone was willing to admit. When Khrushchev announced that an American spy plane had been shot down over Soviet territory, it sent tremors through the corridors of power around the world. At first, many dismissed it as another example of Soviet propaganda. Such bold claims were common during the Cold War, when both sides accused each other of lies and deception. In Washington, officials gathered in tense meetings, uncertain of what the Soviets actually knew. The CIA had lost contact with Power's aircraft, but they hoped against hope that he had managed to destroy the plane or die in the crash, leaving no evidence behind. They had no idea that Powers was alive, and even less that the Soviets had recovered the plane almost completely intact. The U.S. scrambled to come up with a cover story. NASA was instructed to release a public statement saying that one of their weather research aircraft, a U-2, had gone missing while conducting high-altitude meteorological tests over Turkey. They claimed that the pilot might have suffered from oxygen failure and accidentally drifted into Soviet airspace. It was a desperate attempt to turn an act of espionage into an innocent mistake. The press printed the story widely, and for a brief moment, Washington believed it might work. But in Moscow, Khrushchev smiled as he read the American response. He had been waiting for it. He knew the Americans had no idea that the Soviets possessed both the wreckage and the pilot. During his next speech, he revealed the truth piece by piece, deliberately drawing out the tension. He told the world that the plane was not destroyed, had landed mostly intact. He told them the pilot was alive, had confessed, and had provided details of his mission. Then came the photographs. Newspapers across the world printed images of the U-2's camera equipment, maps, and classified flight plans. The entire deception collapsed overnight. The United States found itself humiliated before the global stage. Allies were shocked, enemies emboldened. President Eisenhower had to face the world and admit that the flight had been authorized by the U.S. government. It was the first time an American president openly took responsibility for an act of espionage against another nation. Eisenhower hoped honesty might ease tensions, but instead, it fueled outrage. Khrushchev condemned the U.S. as aggressors, accusing them of violating international law and threatening world peace. Soviet newspapers called Powers a criminal, and the CIA reckless warmongers who played with fire. The timing of the scandal could not have been worse. Just days later, world leaders were scheduled to meet in Paris for a major peace summit. Eisenhower had been preparing for it for months, hoping to reduce nuclear tensions and open dialogue with the Soviets. But when Khrushchev arrived, the atmosphere was poisonous. He entered the meeting furious, waving evidence of the U-2 incident, demanding a public apology and punishment for those responsible. Eisenhower tried to stay calm, but he refused to apologize, arguing that the flights were necessary for America's security in a world where secrecy ruled. The summit disintegrated within hours. Khrushchev stormed out, declaring that he could not negotiate with a country that looked down from the skies like gods. The dream of peace vanished instantly. The Cold War entered a new, colder phase. The global reaction was explosive. Across Europe and Asia, people feared that diplomacy had died and war was again on the horizon. In the United States, citizens were torn between pride and fear. Some called Powers a hero who risked his life for his country. Others believed his capture had brought the world dangerously close to disaster. In Moscow, banners declared the strength of their defenses against American aggression. In secret military installations on both sides, nuclear bombers were placed on alert, ready to take off at a moment's notice. Submarines were armed, missile silos opened, and radar operators worked around the clock. The incident became a chilling reminder of how easily a single mistake could lead to catastrophe. The line between espionage and open war had blurred, and the fear of total destruction hung over the world like a dark cloud. The U-2 crisis had done more than expose a spy mission. It had shattered the fragile trust that had begun to form between East and West. The hope for peace was buried beneath suspicion, anger, and pride. The world had stood on the edge of nuclear confrontation. Not because of bombs or armies, but because of one pilot, one plane, and one mission that went terribly wrong. After his capture, Francis Gary Powers was taken to Moscow, where he was kept under tight surveillance by the KGB for weeks. He was interrogated day and night inside the notorious Lubyanka prison, a place that had seen countless spies, dissidents, and prisoners of war pass through its cold iron gates. His interrogators used every method they knew: psychological pressure, intimidation, long hours of questioning to break him down. They wanted names, mission details, and proof that the CIA had sent him deliberately to gather military intelligence. Powers, exhausted and isolated, said little. He explained that he was only following orders, that he had no political motives, and that his task had been purely photographic. But the Soviets already had all the proof they needed. The U-2's wreckage had been collected almost completely intact. Its cameras, film, and classified instruments were displayed proudly by Soviet engineers and military officials as trophies of their success. They showed the world that the Americans had been spying directly over their most secret facilities. Powers' personal items, his maps, survival kit, and even the disguised silver dollar containing a poison needle were presented as evidence of deliberate espionage. When the Soviets announced that they were putting him on trial, it became one of the most publicized events of the Cold War. Powers was brought into a grand Moscow courtroom packed with journalists from across the globe. Flashbulbs exploded as he entered, his expression somber, his uniform replaced with a plain suit. The trial was more theater than justice. Everyone knew the verdict before it began. The prosecutors painted Powers as a dangerous agent, sent by a hostile nation that had violated Soviet airspace in preparation for possible nuclear war. His defense lawyer, appointed by the state, could do little but plead for mercy. As the trial continued, the evidence was laid out meticulously. The wreckage of the U-2 was displayed, along with photos of secret Soviet sites that Powers had captured during his flights. Experts were brought in to explain the sophisticated equipment, and the courtroom gasped when the tiny silver dollar was opened to reveal the hidden needle meant for suicide. It was the Soviets' way of proving that the mission was not a mistake, but a deliberate act of espionage. When Powers was asked to speak, he remained composed. He admitted to flying the mission under orders, but insisted he was no enemy of the Soviet people. He said he had never intended harm. His role was to gather intelligence, not to drop bombs. The court listened, unmoved. After several days of proceedings, the judges read out the sentence: 10 years, 3 in prison, followed by 7 in a labor camp. Powers barely reacted. He had expected this outcome from the start. In the United States, the news of the trial reignited old debates. Some called for action, demanding that the U.S. retaliate against the Soviets for their treatment of an American pilot. Others saw Powers as a victim of circumstance, a man trapped by the dangerous game his government played. Meanwhile, in Moscow, the Soviets celebrated their victory, using the trial as propaganda to show the strength of their defenses and the weakness of American denials. Powers began his sentence quietly, confined to a small cell and watched constantly by guards. But behind the scenes, both nations were already thinking about what came next. The Cold War was as much about bargaining as it was about confrontation, and spies were valuable pieces on the chessboard. Around this time, the Soviets were facing their own problem. One of their top intelligence officers, Rudolf Abel, had been captured and imprisoned in the United States. Abel was no ordinary agent. He was one of Moscow's most skilled spies, operating under deep cover for years. His capture had been a major blow to Soviet intelligence. Eventually, the idea of a trade emerged. It would be a delicate operation, requiring months of negotiation through secret channels and intermediaries. Both sides were wary, but by early 1962, the deal was finalized. The location chosen for the exchange was the Glienicke Bridge, a narrow steel span connecting East Germany and West Berlin, a place that would soon earn the nickname the Bridge of Spies. On a cold, misty February morning, 2 small groups gathered at opposite ends of the bridge. The tension was so thick that even the air seemed to hold its breath. On one side stood the Americans with Powers, pale and thin from his time in prison. On the other stood the Soviets, with Abel, calm and dignified as ever. At a signal, both men began walking toward the center of the bridge, flanked by agents and soldiers. The sound of footsteps echoed in the silence. When they met in the middle, There was no handshake, no words exchange, just a nod, a brief glance, and a quiet passing from one side to the other. The moment was over in seconds, but it became one of the defining images of the Cold War. Cameras captured the exchange, the fog wrapping around the bridge like a veil between two worlds. Powers was free at last, crossing into the west as Abel disappeared into the east. Back home, Powers' return was met with mixed reactions. Many Americans expected a hero's welcome, but instead they found controversy. Some critics accused him of failing his mission, of not destroying his aircraft or using the poison to prevent capture. The CIA stood by him quietly, but public opinion remained divided. Powers himself was deeply affected by the experience. He tried to rebuild his life, later working as a test pilot and helicopter reporter. But the shadow of the U-2 incident followed him until his death. His capture, trial, and eventual exchange told more than just his personal story. They revealed the hidden cost of the Cold War. Beneath the headlines and speeches were men who risked everything in a silent war, fought through deception, fear, and courage. The image of Powers crossing that misty bridge became a symbol of that fragile world, where peace and destruction were always just one step apart. The U-2 incident did far more than expose a secret mission. It tore apart the fragile sense of understanding that had been forming between the United States and the Soviet Union before Francis Gary Powers' plane fell from the sky. There had been cautious hope that the Cold War might cool down. President Eisenhower had planned to meet with Nikita Khrushchev in Paris, a summit that many believed could mark the beginning of real dialogue between the two superpowers. Both nations had suffered from years of fear and rivalry, and there was a quiet wish, even among ordinary citizens, that the arms race might finally slow. But the wreckage of the U-2 destroyed that possibility overnight. When Khrushchev announced to the world that the United States had sent a spy plane deep into Soviet territory, the message was unmistakable. America was not interested in peace, it was preparing for war. In Moscow, the propaganda machine went into overdrive, showing photographs of the captured plane and pilot to every major newspaper and broadcasting the story across the world. The Soviet people were told that their country had been the victim of American aggression, and Khrushchev's popularity soared. At the same time, in Washington, Eisenhower faced intense embarrassment. His government had been caught lying about the mission, and the U.S. appeared dishonest and reckless on the global stage. The fallout was immediate. Khrushchev canceled his planned visit to the United States and walked out of the Paris Peace Summit, condemning Eisenhower personally for authorizing the flights. Every effort toward easing tensions vanished in a matter of days. Instead of diplomacy, both sides turned to defense and retaliation. In military circles, generals and strategists began to talk less about negotiation and more about deterrence. The idea that safety could only be achieved by having enough weapons to destroy the enemy completely. In the months that followed, the arms race accelerated like never before. The United States pushed to expand its nuclear arsenal, develop faster missiles, and improve its global network of bases and early warning systems. The Soviet Union responded by building more launch sites, deploying long-range bombers, and strengthening its alliances across Eastern Europe. Both nations poured billions into their military programs, feeding a spiral of fear that seemed impossible to stop. Each side justified its buildup by pointing to the other's actions. And before long, the dream of peace had been buried under mountains of warheads. The U-2 incident also struck a devastating blow to the Central Intelligence Agency. The agency's reputation had been built on secrecy and success, but now its failure had been broadcast to the entire world. Within the CIA, analysts and directors were forced to face an uncomfortable truth. Their reliance on manned spy planes had become too risky. The skies were no longer safe for human pilots, especially with Soviet air defenses improving rapidly. Powers' capture had exposed the agency's methods, and any future mission risked another international disaster. This realization forced a revolution in American intelligence gathering. The CIA began to explore new technologies that could collect information without sending pilots into harm's way. This shift gave birth to some of the most advanced programs in U.S. history, projects like Corona, the first successful spy satellite program, and the creation of new aircraft capable of flying faster and higher than anything before, such as the A-12 and its successor, the SR-71 Blackbird. These machines could photograph entire countries from the edge of space, and their existence marked a turning point in how espionage was conducted. The Cold War had entered a new phase, one where machines, not men, carried the burden of risk. But the damage to international trust could not be undone. The U-2 incident deepened paranoia on both sides. Soviet leaders became convinced that the United States would stop at nothing to spy on or sabotage their nation. In response, they expanded their own intelligence operations abroad, sending agents deeper into Europe and America. In Washington, officials grew equally distrustful, believing that the Soviets were preparing new military threats. The world became a chessboard where every move was met with suspicion, and every action had the potential to ignite war. 2 years later, the consequences of that mistrust exploded again during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Ironically, it was another U-2 flight that discovered Soviet nuclear missiles being installed in Cuba. The same aircraft that had once brought disaster now delivered the information that nearly triggered a nuclear confrontation. The shadow of the 1960 incident hung heavily over the White House. President Kennedy, aware of how quickly a spy mission could spiral out of control, treaded carefully as the crisis unfolded. For 13 tense days, the world teetered on the edge of nuclear war, a chain of events that in many ways had begun the day Power's plane was shot down. In the end, the U-2 incident changed the world in ways few could have predicted. It hardened the Cold War into an age of suspicion, secrecy, and unending competition. It destroyed personal trust between leaders, fueled the greatest arms built-up in human history, and ensured that fear-not friendship would guide international relations for decades to come. For the CIA, the mission became both a failure and a lesson. They learned that technology could replace risk, but not responsibility. And for the world, it was a chilling reminder that in the nuclear age, even a single misstep could end life as humanity knew it. The Cold War would continue for 30 more years. But after the U-2 incident, it would never again be fought with words of peace. It would be fought in shadows, secrets, and the silent race for survival. The years that followed brought an even deeper understanding of how close humanity had come to disaster because of one single decision. As more documents and testimonies emerged, the full scale of Operation Grand Slam's danger became undeniable. Historians, intelligence officers, and even some of the people who had helped plan the mission began to admit that it had been a perfect storm of The mission was not just about gathering information. It was a high-stakes gamble played in the most volatile era in modern history, when one wrong move could have ended the world as we know it. The newly released CIA archives revealed chilling details about the internal discussions before the mission. Intelligence officers debated for weeks, weighing the risks against the need for information on Soviet missiles. Some warned that the Soviets' air defense network had expanded dramatically, and that radar coverage now extended far deeper than before. Others argued that the U-2's altitude still made it untouchable, clinging to the belief that technology could outsmart human suspicion. Meetings grew tense as pressure from the Pentagon and the White House increased. The Americans wanted to know how many nuclear weapons the Soviets had, where they were located, and how advanced their delivery systems were. Without that knowledge, the U.S. would be fighting in the dark if war broke out. Eisenhower's own concerns were strikingly human. The declassified transcripts of his meetings showed a man caught between fear and duty. He wanted peace, but he also feared that if the U.S. stopped its surveillance, the Soviets might gain a decisive military advantage. Every option before him carried risk. If he refused the mission, he might leave his country vulnerable. If he approved it, he might start a war. When he finally agreed, it was not out of confidence, but out of resignation, a belief that the mission would happen eventually. Whether he delayed it or not, behind the scenes, the CIA had been facing its own form of pressure. Each successful U-2 flight had made the agency bolder, more certain that it could operate without consequence. They had been lucky for years, flying above the reach of Soviet defenses. That success had created a dangerous illusion of invincibility. Engineers and analysts ignored growing evidence that Soviet radar was adapting. Reports from previous flights hinted that the U-2 had been tracked at several points, but the agency brushed those aside. They believed that even if detected, the Soviets couldn't touch them. That assumption would prove fatal. When the U-2 was finally detected and brought down, chaos erupted in Washington. At first, U.S. officials refused to believe it. They thought the plane must have crashed by accident or run out of fuel. When the Soviets announced that they had captured both the plane and the pilot alive, the shock was immediate. What made the situation worse was that the U.S. government initially lied, claiming it was a weather research aircraft that had gone off course. But Khrushchev had been waiting for that. He deliberately held back the information that Powers was alive until after the U.S. issued its denial. Once the truth came out, the humiliation was complete. America looked deceitful, and Eisenhower's credibility was shattered on the global stage. The Soviets made the most of the propaganda victory. They paraded the wreckage of the U-2 before the press, showing its cameras, film, and survival gear undeniable proof that this was no weather plane. Powers, standing in the courtroom months later, became a symbol of Cold War espionage, a reminder that the U.S. had crossed a line. He sat in silence as the Soviet judges read his sentence, accused of crimes against the state. He was sentenced to 10 years, though everyone knew his real value was not as a prisoner, but as a bargaining chip. The deeper truth revealed by declassified documents was how dangerously the Soviets had reacted during the hours of confusion after the shootdown. Some units had received false radar readings, suggesting multiple intruding aircraft. And there were brief moments when Soviet commanders believed an American bomber formation might be following. Alarms rang in bases across the country. Missiles were readied. Strategic bombers were armed. All it would have taken was one misunderstanding, one frightened commander pressing the wrong button for the entire world to erupt into nuclear war. For Eisenhower, the aftermath was devastating. His dream of peace with Khrushchev, his hope to end the arms race before it consumed both nations, was gone. The Paris Peace Summit collapsed in anger and accusation. The Soviet leader stormed out, denouncing the U.S. as untrustworthy. The window for dialogue slammed shut, and both nations turned again toward weapons and suspicion. The arms race accelerated. Within 2 years, nuclear missiles would appear in Cuba, bringing the world to the brink once again. The U-2 incident hadn't just destroyed trust, it had set a chain of events in motion that nearly led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. For the CIA, the consequences were equally severe. The agency was forced to reevaluate its entire approach to intelligence gathering. The era of invincible spy planes was over. They began investing in satellites and new covert technologies that could operate without risking lives or sparking global panic. Behind the scenes, many CIA officials acknowledged privately that Operation Grand Slam had been a turning point, a reminder that technology and secrecy were no substitutes for wisdom. The declassified files also revealed the haunting reflection of the people involved. Some of the mission's planners wrote years later that they had underestimated the human cost of their decision. Others expressed regret that they had placed so much faith in machines and calculations, ignoring the political reality that every action carried consequences beyond their control. Eisenhower himself, in private writings found after his death, expressed sorrow that his decision might have brought the world so close to annihilation. In the final analysis, what made Operation Grand Slam unforgettable was not just the drama of the crash or the trial, was the terrifying realization that human civilization had survived purely by chance. If one radar operator had misread a signal, if one missile commander had acted too quickly, the result could have been a global nuclear exchange. All because of one secret flight that was supposed to be routine. The more the world learned about that day, the clearer it became that the Cold War's deadliest battles were not fought with guns or bombs, but with fear. The mission that began as a search for knowledge had nearly ended in extinction. It was a moment when history held its breath, when fate balanced on the edge of human error, and when the world came terrifyingly close to ending not with an explosion, but with a photograph taken from 70,000 feet above the Earth. As the story of Operation Grand Slam comes to a close, one truth becomes painfully clear. A single mistake, a single moment of overconfidence, almost ignited the flames of World War III. The entire world, without even realizing it, had come within inches of nuclear destruction because of one spy plane. One mission and one decision made in the name of security. It was a terrifying reminder of how fragile peace can be. When nations are locked in a battle of pride and paranoia, this was not just a mission gone wrong. It was a lesson in how easily human judgment can falter under the weight of fear and ambition. The U-2 incident showed that in the Cold War, power was not only measured in missiles or armies, but in the choices made behind closed doors. choices that could decide the fate of millions. One pilot's fall from the sky became a symbol of how thin the line truly was between peace and devastation. For decades, this operation remained buried under layers of secrecy, hidden away in classified files and guarded conversations. But when the truth finally emerged, it shocked the world. The revelation proved that sometimes the greatest threats to humanity are not deliberate acts of war, but the accidents born of secrecy, distrust, and miscalculation. This was the mission the world was never meant to know, a mission that nearly ended everything. If you want to uncover more untold stories from the Cold War, the hidden operations, the forgotten heroes, and the moments that shaped our world, make sure to subscribe to Cold War Files, because history's most dangerous secrets are often the ones that were never supposed to be